This is the story of the House of Bread. There was once a baker who lived in Bethlehem. It was a good place to be a baker, because Bethlehem was surrounded by terraced fields stretching down the high hill on which it stood, which grew good wheat and barley. The grain made fine flour for baking into bread. The town's name even reflected that. People said that Bethlehem, in Hebrew Beit Lechem, meant the house of bread. The baker had done well for himself in this house of bread. He was married and had 2 young daughters, Ruth and Naomi, and he'd been able to build a good house for them all to live in. At first it was just one room, like most of the houses in Bethlehem, with a section at one end down a few steps where the animals were brought in at night, with a feeding trough on the raised platform. But as the baker prospered, he was able to build a storeroom for his jars of flour, and a guest room for visitors, and even a shelter on the roof where the family could sleep out on hot summer nights. All was well, until the Emperor Augustus in far-off Rome decided that everyone in his empire should return to the place where their families came from, so he could count them and make them pay him money. The baker and his wife didn't have to go anywhere. Their families had always lived in Bethlehem. But soon the town was full of those who'd moved elsewhere, coming back home and needing somewhere to stay, and relatives who'd put them up. Soon there were aunts in the baker's guest room, uncles in the storeroom, cousins in the roof shelter. Then the baker's wife's mother's nephew turned up with his family, and the only place left to put them was in the baker's family room. "Still, never mind," said the baker's wife. "If we all budge up, I'm sure we'll fit in. We can sleep down at the animals' end of the room. It's a bit smelly, but it'll be warm." "All right," said the baker, "but really, after this, we have no more room. And even if we had room," he whispered to his wife, "we have no food left to feed all these people. I looked in the storeroom just now, and I'm down to the last handful of flour in the last jar. There isn't even enough to feed our own guests, never mind to have any to sell to the people of Bethlehem. I don't know what we're going to do when it's all gone, because I know that all of Bethlehem is in the same state." "God will provide," said his wife. "He's told us we should welcome people, and we must never forget, after all, why we gave our children the names we did." The girls pricked up their ears. "Well, why did you give us these names, Mother? Why did you call us Ruth and Naomi?" "Dear me, have I never told you the story?" "No, tell it now," said the girls. "Well, I suppose it is bedtime, so perhaps I should. Many years ago, in the time of your great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandparents, a woman lived in Bethlehem called Naomi." "That's me," said the older girl. "That's right," said her mother. "She lived here with her husband and her 2 young sons. But there was a famine. The food ran out. Naomi and her family had to leave, or they would have starved. But they had to go all the way to the land of Moab before they found food." "Moab? But they are our enemies," said the girls. "It's true, we have often fought with them," said their mother, "but on this occasion they were kind. They welcomed Naomi and her family, and there her 2 boys grew up, and in time they married Moabite girls. But then tragedy struck again. Her husband and her 2 sons got very sick, and they died. Naomi was left all alone in a foreign land. She decided that the only thing she could do was go home to Bethlehem. Surely there her own family would take her in. It was the custom of their people that they should. So Naomi said goodbye to her sons' wives. They could marry again in Moab, she said. But one of them, called Ruth— "That's me," said the younger girl. "That's right," said her mother. Ruth insisted on coming with Naomi. She said, Where you go, I will go. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God." So off they went together, Naomi and Ruth. But when they got to Bethlehem, no one would take them in. No one would look after them. They had no money, no food, no friends. Fortunately, it was the time of the barley harvest, and Naomi remembered another custom of her people. She hoped this one hadn't been forgotten, like the law of hospitality. "Go out into the fields," she said to Ruth. "It's a law here that the farmers mustn't cut the crops right up to the edge of the fields or go back for what they've missed, so that there'll be some left for people like us who have no land and no crops of our own. So you should be able to gather a little barley for us to eat." So that's what Ruth did. She worked all day long in the hot sunshine. But at the end of the day, she'd gathered enough to feed them for a day or two. She hadn't realized, though, that the owner of the fields, a man called Boaz, had come by while she was working and had noticed her. He asked his farmhands who she was, and they'd told him that she was Ruth, a Moabite scrounger, who'd come back with a woman called Naomi, who claimed she was round here. They were dismissive, but Boaz saw how hard she worked, and how kind she was, and he realized how much she must love her mother-in-law. He called her over, and much to her surprise he gave her a whole bag full of grain to take home. And, well, to cut a long story short, he very soon fell in love with her, and she with him, and he married her. "Ah, that's a lovely story," said the girls. "But it's not just a lovely story," said their mother. "It's also an important story. Because Ruth and Boaz had a son called Obed. And when Obed grew up, he had a son called Jesse. And when Jesse grew up, he had lots of sons, and the youngest of them was a little shepherd boy who became a king." "Not David? King David? The one who killed Goliath?" said the girls. "The very same," said their mother. "But he wouldn't have been born if Ruth hadn't been kind and generous to Naomi, and Boaz hadn't been kind and generous to both of them. So when we welcome people, we never know what will come of it. We might be welcoming a king." "Well, it's a wonderful story," said her husband, "but it doesn't change the fact that we have no room for anyone else in our house. So the next time someone knocks at our door, the answer has to be no." And just at that moment, you've guessed it, there was a knock at the door. The baker's wife went to the door, and she opened it. Outside was a worried-looking man and a very tired, very pregnant woman. "Please, could you help us?" he said. "We've nowhere to stay, and my wife Mary is about to have a child. Please, can we stay with you?" From behind the door, the baker mouthed "No!" silently at his wife, shaking his head. But she just smiled at the couple and said to them, "Yes, of course you can come in. It's very crowded, mind, and you'll have to sleep next to the animals like us, but our home is your home, and you're welcome." And in they came, and everyone budged up a bit more, and there was just enough room. And it wasn't a moment too soon, because that very night the baby was born. But it was now so crowded in that little house that the only place to put him where he wouldn't be trodden on was in the manger, the animals' feeding trough. What a night it was! The baker's children should have been asleep, of course, but who could sleep with all the excitement of a new baby? So they were still wide awake when a bunch of shepherds came in from the neighbouring fields, saying they'd heard from angels in the sky that the child had been born. They'd been sent to find him. "Who is this child," said Ruth and Naomi, "that all this fuss should be made of him?" "Well, the angels told us he was the Messiah," said the shepherds, "the great leader God said he'd send us." "What, "Like King David?" said the girls. Said one of the shepherds. "Well, the way the angels talked about him, it sounded as if he'd be an even greater king than David. But if God sent him to start life in a manger, maybe he isn't going to be the kind of king who rules from a throne with a golden crown on his head. Maybe he'll be someone who rules in our hearts and shows God's love for everyone, however humble and ordinary they are, like us shepherds. And that's the best kind of king, I reckon." The baker's wife looked at the baker, and she smiled. Just as she'd said, you never knew who you might be welcoming when you took in a stranger. Eventually the shepherds left, and everyone fell asleep, except the baker, because for all the wonderful things that had happened, he still knew that in the morning he'd have nothing to feed his guests, or the rest of Bethlehem. What was he going to do? As dawn broke, he decided that the only thing he could do was to do what he always did, to get up and start baking. He might only have a handful of flour, but it would at least make bread for this new mother and her husband, who needed it most of all. So he crept into the storeroom, picking his way over the sleeping uncles who were lying there, and he lifted the lid of the flour jar. Sure enough, there was just a handful left. He scooped it out and went into the courtyard to mix it. He fired up the bread oven till it was good and hot, and then he shaped the dough into a flat circle and put it in the oven to bake. While it baked, he went back to the storeroom to put the lid back on the jar. As he did so, he peered inside. How strange! There was still a handful of flour left in the bottom. "I'm sure I emptied it," he thought to himself. "Still, if there's some more, I might get another flatbread out of it." So he scooped that out and mixed it with water and put it in to bake as well. And back he went to the storeroom. And what was this? There was still a handful of flour left. Again he scooped it out, making sure he got every last speck this time, and went to mix it up and bake it. But when he came back, there was yet another handful there. To and fro he went again and again, but though he emptied the jar every time, there was always more when he came back. Soon he'd made enough bread to feed his household, and then enough to feed his whole street, and then enough to feed the whole of Bethlehem. And so it continued until the little family left Bethlehem for the next part of their journey, the next part of their story. And it's said that when that baby grew up, there were other times when people found themselves miraculously fed on bread and fishes and even wine when there should have been none. And still today, people find that when they welcome others and share their food, not just bread, but also the food of love and hope and joy and peace, however little they feel they have, somehow it always turns out that there's enough and more to spare, for themselves and for everyone else as well.